Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a Friday Reads video where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any bookish things that have gone on. I had my buddy Jamie right next to me, but she moved over here. You can barely see her. She's asleep on the other side of this little lamb chop at the moment. So she's here, but she's decided to move over there for the time being, and it is what it is. But she's here. I know a lot of people were a little disappointed they couldn't see her in last week's Friday Reads video, and this is the last Friday Reads video that I am filming before we leave for Italy. I'll talk about my plans for what posting is going to look like while I'm gone, but it'll be the last time you see her for a while. She's peeking up, so there she is. She woke up, saying hello to everybody. So there you go. That is your sneak peek of Jamie. Actually, she's being really cute right now. There you go. There is your peek at Jamie before Joel and I head off to Italy. The big bookish news that happened this week is some sad news. Unfortunately, this morning it was announced that Hilary Mantel died. She is known mostly for the Thomas Cromwell trilogy of books that started with Wolf Hall and then continued with their really heavy books. So bear with me. Bring Up the Bodies and The Mirror and the Light. Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies both won Booker Prizes. I believe The Mirror and the Light was longlisted and did not make it to the shortlist. It is a tremendous trilogy of books, and she was a huge talent in the writing world. Hit me a lot harder than I would have thought it would. I guess I hadn't really thought about how I would feel in the eventuality of this, but I think because I have enjoyed the books in this series, and because she seemed like such a kind person in all of her interviews, it did hit me very hard, and what a loss. I'm glad she at least managed to finish this series of books, and I did read one other book of hers outside of the series, which is a collection of short stories called The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher. I remember thinking it was just okay. She did release a book earlier this year, and actually this is going to be my next audiobook. It is called Learning to Talk. It's a collection of stories that are sort of about her life or inspired by her own childhood growing up. I believe she referred to them as autoscopic rather than autobiographical, and it should be a really interesting read. It is available. So she did publish something after The Mirror and the Light came out, but I guess I was just really looking forward to finding out what her next big project was and seeing how it went. Wolf Hall is an interesting book. I don't have my copy of it anymore. I don't remember exactly what happened. Sometimes when you move a couple of times, books have ways of disappearing. I think at the time I read it, it's a very dense book. It's a very long book. It's very involved. There's a whole cast of characters in it, and a lot of people have the same name because it's historical. So like a lot of people are named Thomas, a lot of people are named Henry, and things like that. It's a lot to keep track of. You have to be an active reader with that book, and there's a lot of information. It moves through a large chunk of Thomas Cromwell's life to get to the point where it leaves off before you get to Bring Up the Bodies. Bring Up the Bodies is much more of a concise, tight book, and I think it sort of benefits from that, but you really need that essential foundation that Wolf Hall creates. And I felt a little frustrated as I was reading it, but it really stayed with me over the years, and I just am awed by the amount of craftsmanship that went into that book and the rest of the series. And again, I think Bring Up the Bodies really benefits off of all of that foundational work that Wolf Hall has. So if you were frustrated by Wolf Hall, I'd say it definitely pays off with Bring Up the Bodies. My one complaint about the series is that The Mirror and the Light goes back to that sort of broad, dense scope that Wolf Hall has, and I don't think it needed to. It picks up directly where Bring Up the Bodies leaves off, like immediately. Bring Up the Bodies ends with the execution of Anne Boleyn, and The Mirror and the Light begins with the execution of Anne Boleyn. And it takes a really long time to get to Thomas Cromwell's downfall, and I think this could have been that short, tight, concise book that Bring Up the Bodies was, because it could easily rely on the foundation that was established in Wolf Hall as well. But instead, it is also dense and goes through a lot. And it's all beautifully written. but I do think it could have been more of a Bring Up the Bodies and less of a Wolf Hall. Still stunning as an achievement, and I just was really impressed with it. So what a loss. And again, I think Learning to Talk is going to be the next audiobook that I listen to. It's about 3.5 hours long, so hopefully I will be able to listen to it and finish it before Joel and I leave. And hopefully either Sunday or Monday, Joel and I are going to try to film a monthly wrap-up. So let's actually use that as a segue into talking about plans for the channel while I'm going to be gone. So we are going to be in Italy, and I do have stuff that is filmed and will be scheduled on Sunday or Monday. Joel and I will be aiming to film a monthly wrap-up. It's a little early. There will still be, I think, 2 days left in the month, depending on when we film it. But we wanted to make sure we got that filmed and scheduled. So you will be getting a monthly wrap-up from both of us, hopefully later next week. And I have some stuff that is already filmed. I just need to schedule it for while we're gone. We talked, and we might, depending where we are, film a Friday Reads, but I don't want to promise anything because I really want to enjoy the vacation. I'm sure you can understand. It's a vacation we have been wanting to do for over a decade, and it's my first real vacation in a long time. So I want to make sure I prioritize the vacation, but if we're in a place where we can do a short little check-in, probably a short one, we might check in over the next 2 weeks, actually 3 weeks, because now that I think about it, the day we fly back, let me look at a calendar, is a Friday. And I usually film a Friday Reads on Friday and then schedule it to post on Saturday. So since we're going to be in the air, there's a likelihood that there won't be a Friday Reads video for another 3 weeks. And I apologize for that, but I hope you understand. If we are in a place to do it, I'll try to get at least one of those in. I decided I'm going to let the National Book Awards shortlist announcement go because I think that is on October 4th. It's going to be revealed while we are in Italy. And I think I'll just talk about that in a Friday Reads when I get back. They are announcing the Nobel Prize for Literature while we're in Italy. And I think if I'm going to film a reaction video for an award while we're gone, it would probably be that one. But again, that's totally dependent on where I'm at when it is announced. I believe we'll be in Rome. So it will be entirely dependent on whether or not it's easy or I feel like filming a reaction video for that. So stay tuned. But regardless of whether or not I film any new content while we're gone, there will be stuff for you to enjoy. I apologize if I don't manage to get a Friday Reads for the next 3 weeks, but please understand and bear with me. There will be at least stuff for you to enjoy while we are gone. I'm also thrilled that we managed to get our new COVID boosters 2 weeks ago. Really relieved that the rollout was so fast and efficient for them because basically as soon as they were approved, we were able to make appointments at a pharmacy in town, and we got them with 2 weeks to spare before we left. So we had the 2 week period where vaccines are most effective before we left. So that is a relief as well. We can travel knowing that we have that bit of protection with us as well. That is just good to know. I think that covers everything going on in the bookish world and things like that. Let's get into the actual Friday Reads portion of this because I did finish 2 books this week and I have some other plans going. So the first book that I finished this week was The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. I am debating whether or not I want to do a full review of this book because the problem is I have some issues with it and I can't really talk about what the issue is without spoiling the book. So I'm not going to spoil the book here, but I'm debating whether or not I want to do a full review with spoilers to talk about that. So I was really looking forward to this book, as you know, if you follow along. I'm a super fan of Hamnet. It was one of my favorite books the year in which I read it. And when this was announced, I was really looking forward to it. It is one of my most anticipated books of the year, along with Douglas Stewart's Young Mungo. And the reason that's significant is that Hamnet and Shuggie Bain were in the top 3 of the year in which I read both of them. So the fact that both of those authors released new books and they were my most anticipated books was just a funny coincidence. The unfortunate coincidence is that both of the new books ended up being a bit of a letdown for me. I have a whole review of Young Mungo. I liked parts of it. I didn't like other parts of it. And the same is kind of true of this. I took a break from reading, which I talked about in my last Friday Reads video. And by the way, again, thank you for all of the lovely, lovely support. You are all wonderful people, and it is really deeply appreciated. But I had talked about taking a week off from reading. So I stopped this. I was actually listening to the audio. I stopped it at 48%. And I took a week off and then picked up from there. And I had a really hard time getting back into it. And I just wasn't enjoying it anywhere near as much. And at first, I really thought that the book was suffering from that reading experience, the fact that I put it down for a week before picking it back up, and that was the thing that was making it hard to get into. But then I noticed comments on my Friday Reads video where a couple of people mentioned that they didn't like the last half of the book, so it's not just me. I think it's set up in a very interesting way. So there are sort of alternating timelines. The problem that comes from that, and this is not a spoiler, is that Lucrezia de Medici had a very short life. And that's not really a spoiler because in the first paragraph it talks about how she thinks that her husband wants to kill her. So it's not really a spoiler. That's the whole point of the book. She had this short life. You don't really know what happened to her. So Maggie O'Farrell is sort of imagining what might have happened. But because it's such a short timeline, it works in the first half of the book when you have her childhood, which is a very defined thing, and her adolescence when she's married. And she thinks her husband might be murdering her. She gets sick and is wondering if she has been poisoned. So those are two very defined time periods. But by the time you get to about the halfway point of the book, because she had such a short life, there's not much of a difference between the time periods. The alternating back and forth doesn't quite make sense because they're like weeks apart at this point. And it felt a little odd in the second half of the book, or a little strained. I also think the part about her childhood doesn't do a great job setting up who she is, because whenever it talks about her childhood, it sets her up as like this really strong-willed, independent, strategic person, because it talks about her mother and how her mother thinks she made a terrible mistake because she was trying to work on things at the moment of conception. And because she felt like she was working, she ended up with a very independent-minded baby who wouldn't stop crying and was very difficult to manage. So she thought that because she was working, it led to a child who was very strategic and independent and focused in areas that weren't becoming for a lady. And it sets up a version of this character, Lucrezia, that you don't really get. Because once she gets married, she's very meek and submissive. And there are aspects of that that make sense. Because as a woman, as a wife, she was very sheltered. She didn't really get news. And her life as a married woman was very different from her mother's life. Her mother was more ingrained into the life of her husband and the palace, I guess, where they live. So her experience was much more sheltered. Like, all of that stuff was kept away from her. She didn't really know what was going on. She only got gossip that was handed to her. But I don't think Maggie O'Farrell does a great job reconciling the young, independent, strategic child who manipulated her way into meeting a tiger in her father's menagerie with this woman who, meek and submissive seems like it's not quite that, but like the two versions of Lucrezia don't really match up with each other. And there's a really disappointing device in the book that is foreshadowed throughout the entire length of the book almost. And I kept really hoping that it wasn't going to happen, and then it happened. And that's as much of a spoiler as I'll get into here. So ultimately, I think the writing is gorgeous. I think the idea was great. I love that Maggie O'Farrell is building this collection of works about shadowy women in history and giving them their stories back. But this one was not as successful as Hamnet was for me. It's still a very good book, and I would encourage you to read it. Maybe you'll disagree with me, but ultimately that is what I thought of The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. If you would like a spoiler discussion, let me know. Maybe I'll try to film it before I leave, but no promises on that. And if I don't have time, then I'll probably just let it go, because by the time we get back, it'll be sort of null and void at that point. Now, because it is Banned Books Week, I had grand plans to read both volumes of Mouse by Art Spiegelman, but I really haven't been able to devote any time to a print book this week. I really wanted to finish Marriage Portrait so I could dive into the other audio that I did. So I'm going to try to finish these this weekend and get them in time, because I would really like to do that. So this is still coming, but I did finish Marriage Portrait in time to pick up Lawn Boy by Jonathan Evison. So I had mentioned in my last Friday Reads, which will be linked down below, by the way, this is primarily challenged because it has sort of sexual content in it and it has a lot of cursing. It does not actually have that much sexual content in it compared to other books. And again, as I said in my last Friday Reads video, I understand why that would be a thing that you would want to, control your kids' access to. But to me, there are so many worse things a kid could have access to. And this book, really, I feel like people come up with complaints that they feel will be more rational because they don't want to talk about what their actual complaint is. So this book is very much about race and poverty and who has access to opportunities in this country and how difficult it is to make your way in the world when you are starting from behind. And I suspect that is what a lot of people complain about when they're complaining about the sexual content of this book, because it follows a 22-year-old named Miguel Munoz. He goes by Mike. He is not an immigrant. I believe his father may have immigrated from Mexico, but he is born and raised in America. He is an American, but people treat him as if he's an immigrant. And he comes from a very poor family in the Seattle area and just tries to make a go of it. In the beginning, he is working at a landscaping company and he is really good at his job. He enjoys his job, but he gets into a conflict with the guy who owns, because the workers are continually taken advantage of, and he finally has enough, gets into an argument with the boss and gets fired and walks off. And he goes through a series of jobs that he takes out of desperation and hoping that they will be the one that will give him a leg up in life. So it's almost episodic, almost like Gulliver's Travels, where there are sections of a book devoted to a different adventure. Each job is an experience in and of itself, but the chapters don't really line up with that style of thinking. It's just something that occurred to me while I was reading it. For instance, he works for a man who just is a white guy who games the system, almost Donald Trumpish, doesn't pay for things, tries to get away with as much as he can get away with. And he works for another guy who had sort of clawed his way up from lower rungs, but has more privilege than Mike does, and is again able to get away with that as a result. And the ways in which they get ahead by manipulating the system or gaming the system or taking advantage of other people are things that Mike does not want to do himself. So he is sort of alienated from any opportunity. He wants to do things the right way. He wants to be a nice person, and getting ahead doesn't always allow for that. And it's just the journey that he goes on is really interesting. He also goes on a very interesting journey with his sexual identity. And I don't really want to get into that, but he has experimented with a man in the past. And now in this book, he is looking to date a woman, and he hasn't quite figured out what that means for him. So I actually saw this book featured on a list of 10 queer books or banned books that you could read this week from a LGBTQ plus bookstore in Washington, D.C. And that really surprised me. And I think it's really that causes that. And it's so subtle, but it's a really beautifully done journey. And I would say it's not a perfect book. It's not going to be one of my favorite reads of the year. I am glad that I read it. And it reminds me that I think one of the reasons it is important to read banned books is that it really gives you a sense of what people are actually complaining about. Because again, there's nothing that explicit in the sexual content of this book. Yeah, there's a lot of cursing, but there's not any more than a teenager or a young adult would already do. So it is a very politically minded book about how difficult it is for Mike and people like Mike to get ahead, and the hypocrisies of people around him. Like at one point his truck breaks down and people are like, well, just get another truck. And they just fundamentally do not understand that he just can't magically buy another truck. His lawnmower is stolen from him at another point early on in the book. And people are just like, buy another lawnmower. And he's frustrated because people don't, and that is really how people treat you when you don't have money. They just don't realize that when you don't have money, you don't have options. And I think that comes across very well in the book. It was a good experience. I'm glad that I read it. And it's sad that it's challenged because, again, it's just a story about a kid and a system that is almost designed to keep him and his family down when they are at heart good people. I had been reading Now in November by Josephine Johnson. I don't have my copy of the book. I really put it down to focus on, again, finishing the audio of Marriage Portrait and then finishing Lawn Boy. And when I thought about it yesterday, I realized I'm probably not going to finish Now in November before we leave anyway. And I was only, I think, like 49 pages into the book. So I'm going to hold off on that one until we get back. And I'll pick it back up for my Pulitzer Prize project and go from there. I have some plans about what I would like to read while we're gone. I am actually doing something radical for me. I'm not packing any physical books to take with us. That's huge for me. I've never done that. I've never gone on a trip, especially a long trip, without having a physical book. I'm going to go entirely digital. So there are ebooks that I have saved on Scribd or through Libby, my library app, and that I can consider while we are gone, and audio otherwise. So I have some ideas for what I'm going to be doing, but I'm going to take it as I go. And I'll try to check in with you while we're gone and let you know what I've been reading and doing from that perspective. So I think that covers everything for this Friday Reads video. Again, this could potentially be the last Friday Reads video for 3 weeks. So if it is, I apologize for the gap, but I hope you understand why that is the case. I do hope that we are able to at least do a quick check-in for at least one Friday while we're gone, and we will see how that goes. And here comes Jamie to say goodbye. It's going to be hard being away from Jamie for 2 weeks, given everything that's happened this year. But I think she's going to be happy. She'll be having a good time here. We have a great place where she goes to stay, and she loves it there. So we'll miss her terribly. But there she is, hanging out, going back to sleep. And actually, it's her dinner time, so I'm really going to wrap this up and feed her. And I will check in with you when I can while I'm gone. I'm hoping I can film at least one more video before we go, but we'll see how timing goes with that. So I will leave it at that. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.